2016 election cycle, it seemed like the only thing major news networks talked about was the intricate, drama-filled details of the candidates. With the rise of modern journalism and social media, the influence they have on us has been rather detrimental. I'm Mora, and I'm here today to make the claim that constant media coverage of national elections has a significant negative impact on our society. I'll be explaining this and supporting this in 3 ways. First way is that this coverage threatens the very nature of democracy. The second way is that this coverage tends to cause voters to have potentially ill-formed and narrow-minded opinions. And the third way is that this coverage provides a distraction from the rest of the world. So, let's dive into the first supporting claim, that this coverage threatens the very nature of democracy. So, this society was created on the basis of democracy. Our government is designed in a way that provides elected officials for the American people from a local level to a national level. Despite the existence of this elaborate system, major media coverage tends to pick and choose which stories get more exposure. This, in turn, hurts local government and smaller political activist groups. When was the last time you stepped foot in your city hall to share your comments, opinions, or questions with your local government? Have you ever done so at all? Neil Caron's study on national electoral participation found that there is a significant lower percentage of turnout in mayoral elections compared to percentages of turnout in presidential elections. The average turnout during the 2004 mayoral elections in the whole nation was 27%, compared to 59% during the presidential election of the same year. And this first number, the percentages of turnout at mayoral and local government elections, is steadily declining as the years go by. Now, when it comes to political activist groups, especially smaller ones, lobbying groups that get more media attention, like Black Lives Matter or the NRA, have more exposure and influence in voters and candidates alike. Now, any individual can share their opinion or ideas with a politician, but that rarely has much of an effect. This is where lobbying comes into play. Lobbying organizations with government connections and larger budgets have way more influence than an individual voter does. In his book on lobbying and policy change, Frank Baumgartner found that groups with higher level government connections are able to achieve 78% of their desired outcomes, while groups with steady membership but not as many high level government connections only achieve 50% of their desired outcomes. So speaking of citizens and individuals, this brings me to my second supporting claim, that this coverage often causes voters to have potentially ill-formed and narrow-minded opinions. So this coverage causes voters to take the peripheral route in terms of the elaboration likelihood model. And that should ring a bell for you, considering it was one of the questions on our first quiz. If you recall, the peripheral route skips the actual processing of the message in the argument, and instead just grasps onto a single point that seems to stand out. This means that voters may tend to take reports at face value and may be less likely to actually research the information. This is evident in a journalist named David Webb's journey to Wisconsin, where he found himself in the middle of an anti-Trump protest. What he did is he asked all the protesters what the exact policy was that they were against, and many of them were really passionate, but they couldn't give a specific answer. This is what he had to say. What you've got is a lot of people who are simply parroting what's been said, which is really kind of sad, because at one point, I'm at a university, and whether you agree or disagree, if you're at a university, a learning institution, you should at least know what you're protesting against and why. Now, confusion in protesters like this often cause violence and really polarizes voters, and this is evident and this is one of the many examples in a Washington Post article titled that a man clobbered pro-Trump protesters with a bike lock at a Berkeley rally. And again, this is one of the many violent situations that have occurred because of the disparities between voters. So, not only does this coverage disrupt relations with each other, but also with the rest of the world. So, distractions tend to arise when media has covered a topic so often. This causes voters to appear oblivious and ignorant when it comes to discussions on real events. Chitra Najaran, a worldwide human rights activist and writer, stated on Public Radio International that There are lots of things happening in other countries. We no longer live in an era of a single superpower. You have rising economies. Just look at China, India, Nigeria, South Africa, and Brazil. We can also see things like this in our own lives. When you're watching an American news channel, especially during the 2016 election season, you would often see stories about things that have been talked about so often, like Hillary's emails or Trump's multitude of inappropriate comments. And meanwhile, you'd see events from around the world merely scrolling on the bottom of the screen. Now, I'm not saying that media coverage is inherently bad, but it can come to a point where many media outlets resort to talking about juicy details in order to keep viewers, listeners, and readers interested. After all, these media outlets are working in self-interest. And as a result, the American value of democracy is threatened, tensions rise between voters, and we become disconnected from the hundreds of other countries around the world. Thank you.
All right, there are a lot of things that are really solid here. I thought at the beginning the proposition is extremely clear. There's an excellent layout of the contents. There's a pretty straightforward controversy that you're setting up here. So a good start. In the body of the speech, you cite the first point as you're getting to it, and that's fine. Then there's a lot of explanation about some of the problems that democracy faces. Here's the thing that I think is a little bit problematic, and that is that I'm not sure that you have a lot of connection to the way media covers things on that first point. Even though you've got some good statistical information on the outcomes of, the turnouts on the elections, for instance, the notion that that is caused by media coverage or the choices that they make and what they emphasize to talk about, that's the thing that I think is missing. So there's a link here that's assumed instead of demonstrated, and I think that's a little problematic. The influence of special interest groups and lobbyists is shown to be, again, you've got another statistical piece of information here where you are making this connection. I think we could use a little bit more about how that scholar came up with those particular conclusions, but even then, 50% versus 78%, it's a difference, but I'm not sure that how significant a difference is. And if you are suggesting, for instance, that there are a lot of people who have substantially less than 50%, I think you need to say that as well. On the second point, this is where you do talk about some of the coverage and some of the problems that happen and how voters are likely to respond in these in going at like the single issue, or like you talk about the peripheral route and making a decision. You explain the concept. You've got a couple of hypothetical examples here. I do think that you might have something here that's pretty important, but I think there needs to be a little bit more information to document that. I'm not sure it's sufficient to arrive at the conclusion that you've got. Your third point, I didn't hear the signpost on it. I had to double check what you had the preview as the label for that particular point. However, you do also rescue yourself a little bit at the end, because I thought you had an excellent summary at the end of the speech reminding us of the points that you're making, and that's one of those things that can happen. A good summary can maybe help repair something that wasn't quite as distinctive in the body of the speech. But again, some of the same information here. You've got some examples of media coverage, certain types of things. Obviously, we get Hillary and Trump and all the things that were going on with them, but you suggest that other issues are put, like you said, in the scroll at the bottom so that they're not getting the same level of attention, and I think you need to find some way to measure that or find some authority who has reached a similar conclusion, because although I might be inclined to believe what you're saying, I'm afraid I'd be choosing the peripheral route and doing that also, because it seems most intuitive to me based on the visual, that if it's just in the scroll, it's less important. But I'm not exactly sure that that's a legitimate conclusion to make. I thought you had an excellent presentation. You do a very good job with your voice and speaking to the audience. And like I said a minute ago, you had a very good summary as well. Thank you.